We lived in a lovingly restored colonial on Habersham Street, just close enough to Forsyth Park that I could hear music drifting through the air on Sundays. Wide porches, floorboards that creaked just enough to feel like home, hydrangeas that exploded into bloom every summer like little secrets. Daniel bought the house the year we married, called it our fresh start. I painted the walls myself, picked every curtain, stocked the kitchen with recipes passed down from my grandmother's handwritten notebook in Charleston. It wasn't just where we lived. It was where I dreamed, or thought I did. But when I look back, I see it now. The shift, the soft unraveling that began 2 years ago, maybe more. At first, it was just little things. Late dinners, hollow excuses, eyes that seemed to look through me more than at me. He blamed work, his parents, stress, everything except what was right in front of him. Us. He stopped calling me darlin'. He started locking his phone. He forgot our anniversary one year, then my birthday the next. Eventually, it felt like he forgot me. Still, I told myself it was normal, that every marriage has seasons. I filled the silence with routines. Morning walks beneath the Spanish moss. Journaling at that little cafe near the river. Rearranging the same shelves over and over again. Harmless things. Quiet things. Things that kept my hands moving when my heart didn't know what to do. But in the quiet, something else stirred. Questions started slipping into my thoughts like shadows at dusk. Why was our savings shrinking so fast? Why did he suddenly have to travel every other weekend? And why, just once, did I catch a scent on his jacket? Floral, cheap, unfamiliar? I never asked him. Not aloud. Confrontation wasn't my way. Observation was. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Receipts he left balled up in his pockets. Strange names on our call log. Credit card alerts that never matched what he told me. I started a file. Just a small folder tucked behind the flower jar in the pantry, out of sight but never far from reach. That's when things shifted inside me. People think revenge comes from rage. But for me, it came from silence, from watching, from learning. The moment I stopped trying to fix what we had, I started to see who he really was. Daniel wasn't unraveling. He was calculating, strategic. He wasn't falling apart. He was preparing an exit. Quietly, carefully. So I made a plan too. Only mine didn't involve flights or lies or locking my phone. Mine involved patience. The kind of patience that grows in a woman who's been dismissed too many times, who's smiled through too many lies, who's had just enough time to realize that sometimes the best way to win is to wait until they think they've already won. Daniel left Savannah just as the sun was rising. No note, no confrontation, just a text, cold and clean, blinking on my screen at 6:14 a.m. I've moved on. The house is sold. Don't try to contact me. Short, brutal, final. He thought that would be it, that he could vanish without consequence and I would crumble quietly behind him. But what he didn't understand, what he never cared to see, was that I'd stopped being his victim long before he pressed send. I didn't respond, didn't beg, didn't even flinch. I let the silence do the work. I let him believe, for just a little while longer, that he'd won. Because while he packed his bags and drove south, chasing whatever fantasy he thought would save him, I was here waiting, watching. What Daniel didn't know was that the sale of the house hadn't gone through. Not completely. And that tiny overlooked detail, that was me. One signature was missing. Mine. And thanks to Sheila, my lawyer, and now one of the sharpest blades in my growing arsenal, that lone missing signature froze everything. The funds, the transfer, the papers. The moment Daniel tried to pull out the profits, declined, because I'd already moved every cent I was entitled to into my private account. Quietly, legally, strategically, the night before he left. While he was plotting his escape, I was 2 steps ahead. That same morning, as he rolled across the Georgia border with Amber in the passenger seat and a suitcase full of delusion. I sat across from Whitaker, the private investigator I'd hired months earlier. He slid a folder across the table, and what I saw inside wasn't just satisfying, it was lethal. Amber wasn't just a fling. She was married to a man named Trevor, and Trevor, it turned out, was very interested in the truth. I sent it all anonymously. A flash drive, a plain envelope, no return address, just one line written in neat block letters. You deserve the truth. A friend. The explosion happened within 48 hours. Amber's husband showed up at her workplace. There were voices, accusations, shattered glass. She moved out. Daniel, still clueless, suddenly found himself without a bed to sleep in. The Airbnb he'd booked mysteriously canceled. Whitaker had taken care of that, and the shady realtor Daniel had used to fake the house deal? He got a visit from the state licensing board after a certain anonymous tip. He dropped Daniel like a hot stone. His carefully stacked tower of lies started to teeter. And I kept smiling. I walked to the market. I watered the hydrangeas. I passed familiar faces near Forsyth Park and answered their questions with a soft smile. "Where's Daniel?" they'd ask. "He needed some space," I'd say. And that was the truth, too, just not the kind they understood. But I wasn't finished. I contacted the board of ethics at his company, sent them everything, the emails, the transfers, the phone logs. I didn't even need to attach my name. The information was enough. Within days, Daniel was under investigation and placed on unpaid leave. No explanation, no appeal, just a quiet unraveling from the inside out. And still, he didn't know I was behind it. I filed for divorce, on the grounds of fraud, infidelity, and financial abuse. Sheila said the case was airtight. I had timelines, photos, witnesses. Every piece slid perfectly into place. Then, just for the final touch of closure I didn't even need, but thoroughly deserved, I scheduled a meeting. Daniel thought he had called it, thought he was in control. We met at a diner off I-95, one of those places with cracked vinyl booths and burnt coffee. Appropriately, he looked older, tired. The crispness had faded. Amber was gone. His job was crumbling. He looked like a man who'd tried to run through a storm and never made it to shelter. I wore the dress he once said made me look too strong. The irony felt like honey in my mouth. He sat down with caution in his eyes, tried to soften his voice, said he wanted to handle things quietly. No lawyers, no drama. I let him speak, let him feel like he had some control left. Then I slid a flash drive across the table. He frowned, asked what it was. I met his eyes, calm, measured. "It's everything," I said. "Every lie, every dollar, every secret you thought I'd never find." He stared at it, his hands trembling. Said something about how I couldn't possibly send that to anyone. I just smiled. "Oh, Daniel," I murmured. "I already have." He didn't finish his coffee. He didn't finish his sentence either. Daniel walked out of that diner without a word. No glance back, no parting shot. Just vanished into the humid Georgia air with a flash drive in his pocket and a storm behind his eyes. But I could feel it, he was unraveling. The kind of man who can't stand to lose, especially not to the woman he thought he had under control. That night, just like I expected, he tried logging into our joint account again. Access denied. He called the realtor. Number disconnected. Tried calling me. Blocked. So he did what men like him always do. When cornered, he went on the attack. 2 days later, a court notice landed in my mailbox. Daniel was contesting the divorce. Not just that, he wanted spousal support. Claimed I was emotionally unstable and had sabotaged the marriage. The irony of it would have been funny if it weren't so pitiful. Sheila, my attorney, took one look at the papers and laughed. "He's desperate. This'll be fun." But I didn't laugh. Not because I was scared, but because it was finally all so clear. Daniel still thought this was about strength, about who could shout louder in a courtroom or twist the truth faster. But this wasn't about muscle. It was about precision. While he was busy scraping together a half-rate attorney in Florida, I was rebuilding the life I'd quietly left behind years ago. I walked back into the architecture studio I'd once called home, unsure if anyone would even remember me. But they did. My old boss didn't hesitate. "We always knew you had the talent. You just needed the space to breathe." And I did. Each day, I could feel pieces of myself snapping back into place. Confidence growing like ivy, quietly and relentlessly. Daniel, meanwhile, was crumbling. The first hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Sheila had a plan, of course. Let him think he's ahead. The more comfortable he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. And that's exactly what happened. He strutted into the courtroom like he owned it. Wrinkled suit, sloppy grin. He tried spinning some wild tale about me being vindictive, unwell, irrational. He really believed the judge would buy it. But he didn't expect our evidence. Unauthorized withdrawals, hotel receipts, emails with Amber, forged real estate contracts. We laid it all out, page by page. Then came the question that cracked him. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, cool and sharp, "why is your name on this property sale when your wife, legal co-owner, was never notified?" Daniel blinked. I thought." "You thought? Or you planned?" And just like that, the air left the room. By the end of the hearing, the judge ordered him to vacate the house immediately. No contact with me, directly or indirectly. Full financial disclosure for the past 18 months. He looked pale, hollow, like a man seeing his own reflection for the first time and not liking what stared back. And still, I didn't celebrate, because I knew better. Daniel doesn't stop when he's losing. He digs deeper, gets nastier, more dangerous. That night, a message popped up on my phone. Block number. No name. Keep pushing and something bad might happen. People know where you live. Cowardly, threatening, and all too familiar. I didn't panic. I called Whitaker. He traced the number in under an hour to a burner phone linked to one of Daniel's old buddies. A sleazy ex-realtor who'd lost his license over fraud and now did consulting work on the side. Classic Daniel, never getting his own hands dirty. We forwarded the message straight to the police and added it to the restraining order request. Another brick in the wall, closing in around him. Daniel was slipping fast. But here's the part he never saw coming. My next move wasn't legal. It was personal. It came from somewhere far deeper than any courtroom could touch, from a wound in his past he thought would never bleed again. Because Daniel Mercer didn't just betray me. There was someone else. Someone who remembered. Someone who had been waiting in silence, just like I had. And now they were ready to speak. And when they did, the real reckoning would begin. 3 days after the hearing, I opened an old email account I hadn't checked in months. There it was, just sitting there like it had been waiting for me all along. Subject, I know him too. From Claire L. Body. We've never met, but I knew Daniel. We were engaged. He left me destroyed, and I'm not the only one. If you're ready to talk, I am too. My hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Engaged? This was before me. I forwarded the message to Sheila immediately. She didn't even blink before warning me. Could be a trap. Be careful. Vet everything. But something about Claire's tone didn't feel like bait. It felt broken. Familiar. I knew the voice of someone who'd been gutted and left to pick up the pieces. I wrote back. We met the next day in a quiet cafe just outside Orlando. She walked in with a cautious smile and a slim folder clutched to her chest. Before you even ask, she said as she sat down, I don't want anything from you. I just want him to finally pay. Then she told me everything. They met in New York, years before I ever knew him. Daniel was magnetic, ambitious, always saying the right things. She was young, fresh out of grad school, caught in the tide of him. He proposed 6 months in. But once she moved into his apartment, the shift began. The control, the gaslighting, The cold punishments for asking too many questions. The cheating. Repeated, unapologetic. I left him the night he shoved me during a fight, she said, her voice steady. I never reported it. I should have. She slid a photo across the table. Another woman I didn't recognize. Marlene. Came after me. He ruined her credit. Took loans in her name. When she lost her job, he disappeared. She's in Chicago now. She's ready to talk, too. Claire had receipts, literally. Emails, voicemails, even legal records he probably thought he'd buried. As I flipped through the evidence, it hit me. This wasn't just about justice for me anymore. It was about all of us. We started building a timeline, a pattern of coercion and psychological abuse, a string of women used, drained, and discarded. It gave my case new weight, but more importantly, it gave us a cause. And that's when Daniel struck back. A week later, I walked into my apartment and immediately felt off. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched. Drawers opened, closet doors left ajar. My favorite perfume spilled across the counter like an exhale. And on my bed, placed carefully, was a printed photo. Me and Claire, taken from outside the cafe window. It wasn't theft. It was a message. I see you. I know. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I didn't flinch. I called the police. There were no cameras in the building, but the cafe had footage. A black SUV had been parked across the street, registered to Amber's brother. Another name, another report filed. He was unraveling and fast. But Claire had one more piece of the puzzle. I found something on one of his old hard drives, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been hiding assets, offshore accounts, under another name. She handed me a flash drive. My hands didn't shake this time. Sheila's eyes lit up when I showed her. If this checks out, she said, already dialing someone, we're no longer talking divorce court. We're talking criminal charges. The walls were closing in around Daniel. Every move I made tightened the net. Every secret he thought he'd buried was being unearthed, one woman at a time. But there was still one shadow in this story I hadn't faced. One final thread I had to follow. Amber. She wasn't just some affair. She was part of this, maybe more than I ever realized. And if I wanted the full truth, really all of it, there was only one thing left to do. I had to meet her, face to face. Amber agreed to meet me at a park on the edge of town, neutral ground. Her message had been brief. You want answers? I'll give you some, but don't pretend you're innocent in this. I wasn't sure what I expected from her. Guilt? Regret? Denial? She arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and walking with the kind of calm that either comes from having nothing left to lose or having lost everything already. She sat on the bench across from me and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Before you say anything, she said, voice even, I'm not here to fight. I didn't look away. Then why did you help him? She didn't flinch. Because I loved him. Because I believed him when he said he was trapped. That you were cold, controlling, that he was only staying out of guilt. The words didn't sting the way they might have months ago. Now, they just made me feel sorry for her. He lied to both of us, I said. Amber let out a soft laugh, sharp at the edges. I know that now. I think I started to figure it out the day he handed me the listing papers for your house and told me to sign them, like it was nothing. I leaned in slightly. Did you know about the other women? She hesitated. That pause said more than any answer could. I know about Claire and Marlene, and who knows how many more. I also know you helped him move money. That makes you part of it, Amber. She shifted in her seat. I didn't know where the money came from. Not really. I thought he was just protecting our future, planning something big for us. I took a slow breath. Your name's on the records. There are files, transfers, notes in your handwriting. Her composure cracked for the first time. I lost my job last week, she said, barely louder than a whisper. My brother's being questioned. And Daniel, he vanished 2 nights ago. He hasn't called. Nothing. I don't even know where he is. There it was, the unraveling. I came here, she continued, voice shaking, because I'm scared. If you take him down, he's going to take us all down with him. I reached into my bag and pulled out a business card. I handed it to her. Sheila, I said, my attorney. You're going to need help. If you cooperate, there's still a chance you walk away from this without prison time. Amber stared at the card like it was a detonator. I don't know what he'll do if I talk. You do, I said gently. That's why you're here. She nodded slowly and tucked the card into her purse. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, he's using burner phones. Changes numbers every few days. But I still have his last one. And a copy of the contract he made me sign for the house. That was it. Exactly what we needed. The final leverage. With her testimony, we had the groundwork for federal charges. Bank fraud, real estate fraud, identity theft. That night, I received another message. Blocked number. Just 3 words. You ruined everything. He knew. He was watching. But so was I. And for the first time in years, I was ahead of him. The next morning, Sheila called. The DA's office wants to meet. This wasn't just a restraining order anymore. We were building a case. But Daniel wasn't done running. Not yet. 3 days later, the bank called. We've detected suspicious activity on your new account, ma'am. Someone attempted to authorize a wire transfer using credentials that don't match your profile. We've frozen it for now. My heart didn't race. It didn't sink. It burned. I had changed everything. New passwords, 2-factor authentication, a digital fortress. But I knew the one thing I hadn't changed. The recovery questions, those innocuous little prompts that only someone who once lived inside your world could answer. Daniel, I wasn't scared. I was enraged. Sheila and I forwarded the incident to the DA's office. Within hours, they confirmed the digital fingerprints matched Daniel's old IP logs. His trail was still warm. The net was tightening. But then, something I didn't expect. Claire disappeared. No calls. No texts. Her online presence vanished like a ghost in smoke. I drove to her apartment. Her mailbox overflowed. The lights were off. And from behind the door, I could hear her cat crying. A cold panic gripped my spine. Had Daniel gotten to her? I filed a missing person report that afternoon. And then silence. 2 days of it. On the 3rd morning, I opened my email to find a video. No subject line, no sender. Just a file. I pressed play with trembling fingers. It was shaky. Low quality. Claire sat hunched on the edge of a motel bed. Her eyes were bloodshot. There was a bruise on her left arm. She looked straight into the lens. He said if I talked again, he'd come for my sister. I'm sorry. I can't help anymore. Don't contact me. No sound but her breathing. Then the screen went black. The DA's team flagged the footage immediately. They suspected coercion, possibly abduction. But with no metadata, no geotags, nothing to trace, it was like she'd been erased. Daniel was escalating. He wasn't just desperate. He was dangerous. I doubled down. I hired a private investigator to find Claire. I upgraded my home security and started sleeping with the lights on again. Amber agreed to move to a legal safe house. She didn't argue. She was scared too. And just when I thought the ground couldn't shift any further beneath me, Sheila called. I need you to sit down for this. I braced myself, clutching the edge of the kitchen counter. Daniel's not working alone. The words hit like a slap. Someone inside the courthouse has been leaking your filings. That's how he's staying ahead of us. He has an inside source. My mind reeled. So much made sense now. The timing, the precision, the way he always seemed to anticipate our next move. How do we find out who? I asked. Sheila's voice dropped. We already did. She sent me a name. Kyle Mercer, court clerk, Daniel's college friend. He had access to sealed motions, upcoming hearings, legal strategy, everything. And now we had proof. Direct deposits into Kyle's account from one of Daniel's known business aliases. It was betrayal at the most intimate level, not just from Daniel, but from the system meant to protect me. I stared at Kyle's name on the screen, then closed the laptop. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a war. And if Daniel wanted to crawl through the shadows, if he wanted to manipulate, to threaten, to use every dirty trick he could find, fine. Let him. I had truth. I had a team. And now I had fire in my chest. He wanted to control the narrative, but I was done being quiet. This time, I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to end this. The call came at 2:13 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I answered, the private investigator's voice cut through the dark like a blade. "We found Claire." I sat straight up in bed, heart pounding. Alive? I didn't dare exhale until he said the words. She's safe, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. They had traced her to a rundown motel on the side of a highway in South Carolina. She had fled on her own, thinking it would keep everyone else safe. But Daniel had found her. He'd sent threats through burner phones, carved cryptic messages into her car door. Silence is safety. The investigator brought her to a secured location. When I arrived, she collapsed into my arms and wept like a child. Her body shook, her voice barely a whisper. I thought if I disappeared, he'd stop. I didn't know who else he'd hurt. I held her tighter. We weren't just victims anymore. We were survivors turning into allies. Meanwhile, Amber started coming forward with more than just documents. One night, over a secure call, she whispered Daniel had a burner laptop. I only saw it once, hidden in a compartment under his desk drawer. Black case, military stickers, fingerprint lock. He used encrypted accounts, I think. I think he recorded conversations with people, important people. That one detail changed everything. The FBI got involved immediately. They secured a warrant, and by dawn, Daniel's office had been raided. The laptop was exactly where she said it would be. Inside, hours of recordings. Voice memos, calls, video files, encrypted backups. Daniel had been collecting leverage on everyone, his partners, his clients, even his own lawyer. It wasn't just paranoia. It was insurance. A way to blackmail his way out of any fallout. But one file stood out from the rest. A call between him and Kyle Mercer, the court clerk. Kyle, she filed the motion. If the judge sees this, you're cooked. Daniel, then make sure he doesn't. Or you'll be in this mess with me. There it was, evidence. In his own voice. It should have been the end. But Daniel was gone. No credit card trail. No phone pings. None of his usual contacts were making moves. It was like he had dissolved into air. Then Amber started receiving emails. Encrypted attachments. No sender. No origin. Inside, brief messages. Don't testify. You know what I'm capable of. He hadn't disappeared. He was lurking. In the shadows. Waiting. That night, I came back from a late grocery run. The parking lot was quiet. My car exactly where I left it. Nothing seemed off until I opened the glove compartment. Inside was a single Polaroid. My parents' house, taken from the bushes outside their front window. My blood ran cold. He was watching them now, not just me. He wanted control through fear, his oldest favorite weapon. But fear had stopped working on me. I called Sheila. It was nearly midnight. Enough is enough, I said, my voice raw. I want to go public. No more silence. Let the world know who he really is. She hesitated. If you do this, he could retaliate. Worse than before. I'm done hiding, I told her. Let him come. We scheduled the interview for the next day. Claire, Amber, and I, all of us on record. Side by side. Not just for ourselves, but for every woman he'd lied to, every person he'd manipulated, every life he'd tried to dismantle. I stared into the mirror that morning. My hands didn't tremble. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. He had built his world on secrets, on power, on silence. And now, that silence was breaking. The walls around Daniel were falling, but the final collapse? That was still coming. The interview aired on a Thursday night. I sat in silence as it played, the screen glowing in the dim light of my living room. Claire's voice cracked on camera, Amber's hand clenched tightly around hers. I watched myself too calm, composed, but inside my heart was pounding like a war drum. We had gone public, and the moment it hit national coverage, the floodgates burst open. Emails, calls, messages from women I'd never met, former clients, ex-girlfriends, colleagues, all with eerily similar stories. Deception, manipulation, stolen money, threats veiled as affection. One woman wrote he ruined my credit, then ghosted me with a smile. Another said he made her believe she was crazy. They weren't just stories. They were proof that Daniel Foster wasn't just a liar or a predator. He was a pattern. And now the world knew. That same night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I should have ignored it, but I answered. "You ruined me." His voice was low and guttural, unmistakable. "You think you've won? I still have cards to play. You forget what I'm capable of." Then, click. No breath, no pause. Just gone. We traced the call within minutes. A public payphone outside a gas station in West Virginia. He was close. Too close. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. I hadn't told them about the call. I didn't want to scare them. But when I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. Nothing was stolen. Nothing broken. Just wrong. There, in the center of the kitchen table, lay a small black box. I opened it with shaking hands. My wedding ring. The one I flushed down the toilet 6 months ago. My stomach turned. How he had it, I didn't know. But the message was clear. I still own you. I called Sheila, the FBI, the DA, everyone. Security was doubled. The indictment process accelerated. Sheila had emergency court protection pushed through by nightfall. But then it got worse. Amber missed her check-in. She was supposed to check in at her safe house every 4 hours. When she didn't respond to her last message, the marshals went looking. Her car was found parked near a state park, keys still in the ignition. Inside, her purse, her phone, and blood on the driver's seat. When I got the call, something inside me just broke. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and felt everything fall away. The fear, the doubt, even the anger. All that was left was resolve. If Daniel wanted to be a monster, then he was going to see what happened when a monster pushed too far. I drove to Claire's, heart like steel. "He's not playing anymore," I told her. "He's escalating. And if we don't stop him now, someone's going to die. Maybe you, maybe me, maybe a stranger." Claire didn't blink. Her eyes burned with the same fire I felt in mine. "What do we do?" she asked. "We set a trap." We coordinated with the FBI. Sheila, Claire, and I spread false information across encrypted back channels Daniel had been known to monitor. Whispered rumors online. Carefully planted bait. We let it slip that Amber was alive and in federal custody. That she was cooperating. That she had given them everything. We knew he'd take the bait. 2 days later, cameras at a Pittsburgh bus terminal caught a man who looked like Daniel. Hooded, bearded, limping slightly, buying a one-way ticket to Buffalo. The feds moved fast. 2 hours after that, a silver SUV was stopped at a rest stop just off the highway. The driver was Daniel. And in the back seat, Amber. Alive, bruised, shaking, terrified, but breathing. She bolted from the car the moment she saw the agents swarming. Collapsed in their arms, sobbing. He told me if I screamed, he'd kill everyone I loved. Daniel didn't resist arrest, didn't scream, didn't run. He just looked out the window at me as they dragged him from the vehicle, and smiled. That same cold, smug smile I'd seen too many times in courtrooms and kitchens and nightmares. Like he still believed he held one last card. But this time, so did I. Daniel sat across from me in the courtroom. Clean suit, pressed tie, calm expression, as if he hadn't spent the last year tearing lives apart like paper. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted from side to side, calculating, searching, always scanning for an exit, always planning his next move. That's who he was. Even now, surrounded by law and consequence, he thought he could win. Amber sat on my left, arm in a sling, bruises still fading beneath carefully applied concealer. Her posture didn't waver. Claire was beside her, gripping the tiny silver pendant around her neck. Her sister's, the one who vanished 6 years ago under unusual circumstances. She was never found, and suddenly I realized this trial wasn't just about me, or Claire, or Amber. It was about every woman who never got the chance to speak. The prosecution built the case like a scalpel to the truth, precise and sharp. Fraudulent contracts, extortion, coercion, threats, and blackmail. The recordings from his hidden laptop played out in the courtroom like echoes from a graveyard. His voice, so smug, so sure, exposed for all to hear. One juror wiped away tears. Another clenched his jaw. They weren't just listening, they were feeling it. Then came the testimonies. Claire spoke first. Her voice wavered for only a moment. He told me I was disposable, that no one would ever believe someone like me, that I was just another broken woman. But I'm not broken. Not anymore. Amber followed, and her voice was steel. He said if I ever walked away, he'd burn my life to the ground. So I set the fire first, and I handed the match to the people who could finish the job. Each word sliced deeper than the last. And Daniel, he smiled, that same smug, cold smile, the one he wore when he thought he had already won. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly. My legs didn't shake, but my heart thundered in my chest. I locked eyes with him and spoke, louder than I thought I could. I loved him. I trusted him. I defended him when no one else would. And in return, he tried to erase me, not just from our marriage, but from my own mind. He gaslit me until I couldn't tell truth from fiction, until I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. But I fought my way back. I reclaimed my voice, and today I use it to end this. Then I played our final card, an audio file Amber had discovered just 2 nights earlier, hidden deep on his laptop. One he'd titled Insurance.mp3. The room stilled as the recording echoed through the courtroom. His voice, calm, deliberate, cruel. If I ever go down, I'll make sure she goes down too. She's not innocent. None of them are. Claire forged documents. Amber stole money. And my wife, she knew everything. She played along until it stopped benefiting her. He tried to twist the story, to drag us down with him, but it backfired, because that recording didn't just prove guilt. It proved intent. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. But just when I thought the worst was behind us, Claire pulled me aside during a recess. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "There's something I haven't told anyone," she whispered. I lied about how I met him." I froze. "What do you mean?" "I didn't meet him through work. It was years before, at a support group. I changed my name afterward, tried to disappear, but he found me again and pretended not to recognize me." She swallowed hard. I think he's done this before. Long before us. I think there are more women. And I think I might be part of the reason they didn't make it out. The weight of her words hit me like a tidal wave. This trial, this fight, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Daniel would face sentencing for fraud, kidnapping, coercion. But somewhere in the shadows, behind all the evidence and legal motions, a darker truth was waiting to be uncovered. He wasn't just a con man. He was a predator. And maybe, God help us, something even worse. So, yes, the trial would give us justice. But the real battle? That was still ahead. The courtroom had turned into a battlefield of truths. Some shouted from the stands. others whispered through trembling lips. But the loudest truth, the one that cut deepest, that one hadn't been spoken yet. 2 days before the verdict was due, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single photograph. Claire, younger, softer somehow, shorter hair, shadows under her eyes. And next to her, Daniel, his arm wrapped around her waist like they'd known each other for years. Like it wasn't a coincidence. Like they were never strangers at all. I stared at the image for what felt like hours before I finally called her, asked her to meet me in person. When I showed her the photo, she didn't deny it. Her face turned white, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the photo, then at me and back again. Finally, she said, "I didn't lie, not completely." I stayed silent. "I did meet him at the support group," she whispered. "That part was true. But I also dated him. Briefly. I didn't know who he was. He used a different name. Said he was healing from trauma. He mirrored mine. Reflected it back at me like a mirror. I fell for it." She looked down. Her voice cracked when she added, "When I tried to leave, he changed. Said if I told anyone, he'd tie me to everything. That people would think I helped him. That I was him." I felt the air shift between us. Like the weight of 10 years had suddenly dropped into the room. She looked up again, her eyes glassy. "I've lived in fear ever since. And the guilt. I thought maybe if I helped bring him down, it would mean something. That I could make it right." In that moment, everything fell into place. Her obsession with the case, her determination to see it through. She wasn't just chasing justice. She was chasing redemption. The next day in court, we were just hours from closing arguments when someone new asked to speak. A woman, mid-50s, steel in her voice, grief in her posture. Her name was Elena Park. She stood before the courtroom with a soft, steady tone and introduced herself as Daniel's ex-wife. They'd been married in 1998. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she said. "I thought I was the only one. That the things he did, the way he erased me, was just mine to carry." She talked about the threats, the isolation, the way he'd turned her family against her, how she moved across the country to escape the ghost of him. The room fell into a silence, so thick it felt sacred. And then Elena looked directly at me. "Thank you," she said, "for not being afraid." I blinked hard, trying not to cry. That moment cracked the case wide open. 7 more women came forward in the following hours. From different states, different decades, all with the same story, the same manipulation, the same trauma, the same predator. The judge granted a delay in sentencing to hear their testimonies. Daniel's lawyers, in a last-ditch effort, pushed for a mistrial. It was denied. Finally, the past he tried so hard to bury was digging itself back up, and this time it had a voice. Outside the courthouse, everything had changed. Protesters chanted. Supporters lit candles. News crews camped out on sidewalks. Hashtags trended. Podcasts exploded with speculation. There were even whispers of a federal investigation. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise, was me. I never wanted this. Not the attention. Not the headlines. I just wanted my life back. But now, people were looking to me like I was more than a witness, more than a survivor, like I was a symbol. I didn't know how to carry that, but I knew I wasn't done. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a second letter arrived. No name, no handwriting, just a sheet of cheap white paper. Typed words. Simple, direct. Justice doesn't change the past, but maybe it stops the future. You stopped him. Now stop the rest. There are more like him. I sat there, holding the letter in my shaking hands, my skin chilled with something I couldn't name. Because they were right. This was never just about Daniel. It was about what he represented. And now, the question echoing inside me louder than ever was, what if justice isn't enough? I remember the way the courthouse felt that morning. too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The final day of the trial, I stood in the hallway, staring at the heavy wooden doors, knowing that once they closed behind me, there'd be no more secrets. Inside, Daniel sat like he always had, composed, polished, rehearsed. But this time, there was a crack behind his eyes. The facade was faltering. The prosecution began their closing with clarity and fire. They laid everything bare. The testimonies, the evidence, the recordings, the patterns spanning decades. Faces flashed on the courtroom screen. Women, families, broken lives. And Daniel's voice, always behind it all, smooth and venomous. Then the defense stood. Their strategy? Cast doubt, blur lines, claim conspiracy. He was framed, the lawyer said, manipulated by emotionally unstable women with grudges. No physical proof ties him to the disappearances. Only words, only anger, only truth, I thought. And then it was my turn, not as a witness, as a voice. The judge had granted me a moment. You may address the court, she'd said. A victim impact statement. I walked slowly to the podium, my legs trembling, not from fear, but from fury held too long. When someone destroys your life piece by piece, you don't feel the damage right away. I began. You blame yourself. You shrink. You pretend it's not happening. That maybe it's your fault for not seeing it sooner. I looked right at Daniel. But survival has a way of reshaping you. It turns whispers into roars. And today, I'm done whispering. I shared what he took from me. Not just my safety, my marriage, or my identity, but my voice. And how I clawed it back, inch by inch, through truth, through sisterhood, through fire. The room was silent. Even Daniel had stopped smiling. When I returned to my seat, Amber squeezed my hand. Claire had tears running down her cheeks. Elena nodded solemnly from the gallery. Then the jury left to deliberate. 5 hours. That's how long it took. When they returned, every heartbeat in that room felt like a drumbeat of fate. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Foster, guilty on all counts. Gasps. Hands covered mouths. One juror cried. I sat frozen, not with disbelief, with release. It was over. Almost. As the judge read the sentence, 35 years without parole, I watched Daniel. No outburst. No last plea. Just stillness. But as they led him away, he turned to me. You think this ends with me? He said, quiet enough that only I could hear. There are others. You'll see. I didn't flinch, because I already knew, and I was ready. It didn't feel like victory right away. The day after the verdict, the world kept spinning. Cars on the road, people in line at coffee shops, children playing in the park. But for me, everything had shifted. I no longer flinched at the sound of my phone. I didn't wake up gasping from dreams I couldn't explain. Daniel was gone. Not erased, but contained. Amber moved into a small apartment across the river. She's rebuilding one piece at a time. She enrolled in a graduate program for forensic psychology. If I can help even one woman spot the signs earlier, she told me, then I've turned the pain into something useful. Claire, after weeks of silence, finally took a trip back to her hometown. She stood at her sister's grave for the first time in years. She called me afterward, voice trembling but calm. I thought I'd never forgive myself, but I'm learning that survival is its own kind of redemption. And me? I moved back into the little house I once shared with Daniel, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. Every wall, every room, every scar it carried, I repainted them all. I planted lavender outside the kitchen window. I adopted a stray cat that refuses to come inside, but insists on napping on my porch swing. Life didn't return to what it was. It became something new. One morning, a letter arrived. No threat this time. Just a simple card with no signature. You lit the match. Thank you for the fire. There's still days I look over my shoulder. Still nights when shadows feel too familiar. But I don't live in fear anymore. because the truth is louder now than his lies ever were. And truth, once spoken, ripples outward. Claire and I launched a foundation, small but growing. It's dedicated to supporting victims of coercive control and psychological abuse. We call it the silent fire, for every woman who burned quietly before learning to roar. We've started speaking publicly. Colleges, survivor networks, media panels. It's not easy reliving it, but it's worth it. Because every time someone hears our story, it plants a seed. And one day, someone might choose differently. Walk away sooner. Speak up louder. Live. This wasn't the ending I expected when I first left Daniel. It wasn't justice in the way the movies promise, neat and triumphant. But it was real, messy, raw, earned. And in its imperfection, it was exactly enough. Daniel was right about one thing. There are others. But so are we. We are the voices he couldn't silence, the truths he couldn't erase, the women who rose together. And we're not going anywhere. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, remember, or realize you're not alone, please subscribe to our channel. Fragments of Us. Stories exist to amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Leave a comment if you've ever felt silenced, or if you found strength in someone else's story. You never know who might need your words. And if you're ready for another powerful journey, make sure to check out our next video. It might just change the way you see the world.